It was January 16th, 1996, a Tuesday night, and the Delta Center in Salt Lake City was filled to its precise capacity of 19,500, a number that the building achieved routinely, and that on this particular evening felt like something other than a statistic. The arena sat at 4,200 feet of elevation, a fact that visiting teams noted in their travel logs, and that Utah's coaching staff noted in how they designed their fourth quarters, knowing that legs from sea-level cities would begin to betray their owners in the final 6 minutes of close games. The air was dry in the way that only high desert air is dry, a dryness that pulled moisture from the throat and settled into the lungs with a slight resistance that players from Chicago or New York or Los Angeles felt as a kind of friction against the air they were accustomed to breathing. The temperature outside was 11 degrees Fahrenheit at tip-off, the January cold of the Wasatch Front pressing hard against the Delta Center's glass exterior, and inside the building the controlled warmth of 19,000 bodies and the overhead lighting had raised the floor temperature to a more comfortable range, though the hardwood still had the slight creak of a surface that had not fully released the memory of the cold outside. The crowd was Mormon country loud, which is a specific kind of loud, quieter in its profanity than other arenas and more intense in its conviction. The crowd of a city that had waited a long time for a relevant franchise and was not inclined to take that relevance for granted. Utah Jazz banners hung from the rafters alongside the retired numbers of franchise legends, and the scoreboard above center court displayed the lineups with the deliberate care of an organization that had been built methodically, over years, without shortcuts, into something genuinely formidable. The Jazz were 30 wins and 7 losses on January 16, 1996, the best record in the Western Conference, and they were playing at home against the Chicago Bulls, who were 32 wins and 5 losses, the best record in the Eastern Conference, which made the game, in some technical sense, the best matchup the 1995-96 regular season had yet produced. Both teams knew they would likely meet again in June. This was understood without being stated, in the way that things which are obvious to everyone require no statement. The Chicago Bulls of that season were operating at an altitude of excellence that the sport had not previously produced and has not since fully replicated. They would finish the regular season with 72 wins, breaking the record of 69 set by the Los Angeles Lakers in 1971-72. Michael Jordan was 32 years old, in his second full season following his return from the retirement that had lasted 18 months, and he was playing with the particular quality of controlled fury that characterized his post-return game, something that had not existed in quite the same form before the interruption, something that the retirement and the return and everything between those two events had deposited in him like sediment. He was averaging 30 points per game. He would win the scoring title. He would win the Most Valuable Player award. He would win the championship. These outcomes were not yet determined in January, but they were present in the way that certain things are present before they formally arrive, the way you can smell rain before the clouds organize themselves into their purpose. Karl Malone was 32 years old that January as well, and he was in the peak of his own considerable powers, the kind of peak that does not announce itself with modesty. He stood 6 feet 9 inches and weighed 259 pounds of muscle that had been built with a discipline so methodical and so sustained that his body had become something other players discuss the way civilians discuss extreme natural phenomena, with a mixture of admiration and gratitude that they were not required to stop it. He had grown up in Louisiana, played at Louisiana Tech, and arrived in Utah in 1985 as a first-round pick who could run the floor and finish at the rim and defend with his body in ways that most power forwards of his era could not replicate. By 1996, he had evolved into something more complete, a player whose low-post game had refined itself over 11 seasons into an instrument of controlled demolition, patient and technical, and ultimately irresistible. He averaged 27 points and 10 rebounds that season. He had been to the All-Star game 9 times. He would win the Most Valuable Player award the following year in 1997 and again in 1999, not coincidentally in the 2 seasons that Jordan was not present to collect it. Malone had a philosophy about toughness that he did not bother to conceal. He had stated it publicly across his career in terms that left no room for interpretive generosity. He believed that the game was fundamentally physical, that what separated winners from participants was the willingness to impose your body on another person, and sustain that imposition past the point of the other person's comfort. He had done this to many players across 11 seasons. He had done it to players larger than him, and to players faster than him, and to players who arrived with reputations and departed with adjustments to make. He respected Jordan in the way that serious competitors respected each other's genuine accomplishments, which is a form of respect that does not preclude the desire to establish hierarchy, because serious competitors are always, underneath the respect, conducting the calculation of where they stand in relation to the people they respect. What had been said in the days before this game was not said by Malone directly. It was said by implication and by body language and by the things that people who observed Malone closely reported back through the channels that operated between teams in that era. The substance of it was this. Utah believed that Jordan's second-act game, the post-return Jordan, relied more heavily on physical positioning and contact creation than the first-act Jordan had, and that this physical reliance was a vulnerability, because Utah had Karl Malone. And Karl Malone did not yield physical positioning, not to anyone, not ever. He had built his entire career on the refusal to yield it. He had made that refusal into something philosophical, into a statement about what basketball ultimately rewarded, and he believed the statement deeply enough to have organized 11 seasons of professional life around its proof. There was also something more personal threaded through the calculation. The specific arithmetic that a 32-year-old nine-time All-Star wants to conduct with another 32-year-old who is generally understood as the best player alive. The arithmetic was not hostile in any simple sense. It was the arithmetic of serious people in serious competition. The calculation was, what happens when we test him? What happens when the greatest player in the world is forced to deal with something that patience cannot immediately resolve, something that 259 pounds of deliberate physical pressure refuses to make easy? It was a reasonable question. It was not a safe question to ask out loud. Jordan arrived at the Delta Center in the particular way he arrived at all arenas. Last off the bus, dressed already in the specific configuration of warm-up gear that his preparation required, moving through the corridor under the stands with the slight forward lean of a man whose body was already ahead of his visible arrival. The corridor smelled of the arena's infrastructure, of concrete and industrial cleaning solution, and the specific staleness of enclosed air that has been circulated through a building for years. Jordan moved through it without accommodation, which is to say his pace did not change for the visiting locker room's distance or the slight incline of the corridor's approach to the floor. Scottie Pippen was beside him. Dennis Rodman was behind them in his own cosmology, wearing something that drew the glances of the stadium workers they passed without Jordan registering the glances at all. In the locker room, Jordan went through his preparation with the invariance that had come to define him more completely with each passing season. The invariance was not rigidity. It was the expression of a man who had discovered through long experimentation exactly what his preparation needed to contain, and had removed everything that was not necessary and retained everything that was, and the result was a routine so precisely calibrated to its purpose that deviation from it would have felt to Jordan like introducing error into an equation that had been proven correct across hundreds of tests. He taped his wrists. He sat for 3 minutes with his eyes half closed, which some observers interpreted as rest and which was not rest. It was computation. Pippen had learned not to interrupt the 3 minutes. Tony Kukoc had been told about the 3 minutes by Pippen with enough specificity that Kukoc had never needed to be told again. Ron Harper was reading something. Dennis Rodman was not in the locker room yet, which was also a form of invariance. Phil Jackson spoke before warm-ups. He said something about the Jazz's defensive rotations and something about Malone's preferred entry points on the left block, and the players listened with varying degrees of engagement. Jordan listened with the full surface of his attention, which was not the same as the full depth of his attention, because the full depth of his attention was already on the floor, already in the game, already several possessions into a competition that had not yet officially begun. The first quarter opened with Utah asserting its home privilege in the way home teams with good records assert it, through pace and noise and the confidence of a group of players who had done this 37 times already that season and had lost only 7 of those times. John Stockton ran the pick and roll with Malone with the automation of a mechanism that had been operating for 11 years without significant modification. The handoff crisp, the angle perfect. Malone receiving the ball at the precise moment and location that maximized the options available to him. He scored with his right hand on a turnaround from the left block that traveled over the outstretched arm of Luke Longley, who was in good position and was beaten anyway by a combination of Malone's size and Malone's footwork and the specific timing of the release, which arrived a fraction of a second before Longley's hand reached its maximum height. Jordan scored 9 points in the first quarter, including a pull-up jumper from the right elbow that had the specific quality of a shot a player takes, not because the look is ideal, but because the look is available, and the player's confidence in his mechanics at that spot on the floor is so complete that ideal is not the relevant standard. The ball came off the glass with the flatness of a shot whose trajectory had been determined well before release. He also drove twice and was fouled twice, converting 3 of 4 free throws, and both drives had involved contact with Malone on the help side, contact that Malone had applied with the body-to-body deliberateness that was his signature. The contact was legal. It was also communicative. It said, "I am here, and you will feel me here, and the game between us is not only being played on the scoreboard, it is being played in the quality of what you are willing to absorb." Jordan felt it. He did not respond to it. Not yet. Not in the first quarter. He played the quarter the way a man reads the first chapter of a long book, gathering information without yet committing to his interpretation. The first layer of pressure arrived in the second quarter, and it arrived through Malone, who was playing with an assertiveness in the post that was calibrated, it appeared, to send a specific message. He posted deep, below where Utah typically established him, in the spot that required the defender to commit fully or concede position, and he used his body not just to score, but to communicate throughout each possession, leaning into his defender on every dribble, turning with a deliberateness that left bruises, finishing with contact that the referees, on 2 successive possessions, declined to call. The 2 non-calls drew noise from the Utah crowd, approving noise, the noise of a building that understood that physical dominance was a legitimate and celebrated form of basketball excellence when Karl Malone was the person applying it. He was not playing outside the rules. He was playing at the exact boundary of them, which was where he had lived his entire career, and he knew that boundary the way you know the edge of a property you have walked for 11 years. Somewhere in the second quarter, Malone said something. The exact words are not in any official record because nothing that is said between players on a basketball floor ends up in any official record unless someone with a microphone is close enough to capture it, and on this occasion nobody with a microphone was close enough. What was said was heard by the players near it and was communicated afterward through the informal channels. And what it amounted to was a provocation, a suggestion, delivered with Malone's particular brand of physical confidence, that Jordan's patience was something that could be tested, that the veteran across the floor from him was the kind of player who had seen everything and could not be rattled by a younger man's urgency or reputation, and that what was happening tonight on this floor was going to reveal something about the limits of even Michael Jordan's capacity to control a game when the man in front of him had 259 pounds of will and 11 years of knowledge to bring to the question. Jordan heard it. He heard it the way he always heard things that were meant to reach him, with the full internal apparatus of a man for whom slights had become a primary fuel source over the course of a career built on collecting them with care. He did not respond. This was the moment that people who were watching closely would remember later, not because anything visible happened at the moment of the provocation, but because of the quality of nothing that happened. Jordan's face did not change. His posture did not change. He ran back on defense at exactly the same pace he had been running back on defense for the previous 20 minutes, and the only thing that changed in any way that was observable was a slight settling of his expression, a microscopic adjustment that Pippen, who had spent enough seasons adjacent to this face to read its topography with something approaching fluency, registered as the expression that meant stored, filed, to be used when the time is correct. Pippen looked away and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say and because Pippen understood that the engine had just received new fuel, and the only sensible response to that understanding was to make sure you were positioned correctly when the acceleration came. The Bulls trailed at halftime by 4. It was not a large deficit. It was the kind of deficit that a team with 32 wins and 5 losses regards as the beginning of the second chapter, rather than the beginning of a conclusion. In the locker room, Jordan sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the floor for a period that was not long enough to qualify as meditation and was too purposeful to qualify as rest. Phil Jackson spoke. Jordan's eyes moved from the floor to Jackson's face and back to the floor. When Jordan spoke, it was to nobody in particular and to everybody simultaneously. He said, "The second half is mine." It was not a question. The third quarter began, and what followed was the demonstration of a principle that Jordan had been building toward since the first possession of the game. The demonstration that patience is not the absence of fire, but its most controlled and efficient form. He scored on his first touch, a post move on the right side that began with a shoulder fake that sent his defender one direction and continued with a pivot and a 12-foot jumper that split the net before the defender had finished recovering. He scored on his third touch, a drive where he took contact from Malone's help-side body and finished with his left hand, the arm extending through the contact as if Malone's 259 pounds were information to be processed rather than an obstacle to be avoided. He made the subsequent free throw, looking at the basket with an expression that suggested the basket was the least interesting thing in his current field of attention. The patience dissolved into precision, and the precision began to accumulate. This was the layer the game had been building toward, the layer beneath the first quarter's observation and the second quarter's provocation and the halftime calculation, the layer where Jordan stopped gathering information because the information was complete and began spending it in the way that only one player in that era knew how to spend it, without waste, without flourish, without anything that existed outside the purpose of making the deficit disappear, and then making a lead appear, and then making the lead grow in exactly the increments required. Malone was still physical. He was Malone. He could not stop being the thing he was. He scored when he touched the ball because he was one of the best players alive, and he was at home, and he was in rhythm. But something had shifted in the architecture of the game. Utah's offense, which had been flowing with the ease of a practiced mechanism, had developed a friction, and the friction came from the way Jordan was now moving on defense, not with the measured energy of the first half, but with something more directed, more specific. A defender who had identified the precise inputs that would disrupt the mechanism and was applying pressure to exactly those inputs, not all at once, not with the wasteful expenditure of energy that comes from general aggression, but with the targeted efficiency of a man who had been watching for 24 minutes and now knew where to touch the machine to make it slow. The Jazz's lead disappeared in the third quarter's 7th minute. The building noise, which had been the aggressive noise of a crowd that believed, modulated into the more defensive noise of a crowd that was hoping, which is a different frequency and a different quality, and one that the players on the floor can feel, in the same way that weather changes can be felt before they are seen. Then, in the 11th minute of the third quarter, came the moment that the game would be remembered by. Not the most athletically spectacular moment, not the highest degree of difficulty play in the 48 minutes. The moment that mattered was simpler and more devastatingly complete than spectacle, because what happened in those 7 seconds was not a basketball play so much as a verdict, delivered in the only court where the verdict was meaningful, and delivered with a precision that had been prepared over 2 full quarters of careful, patient, invisible work. Malone had the ball on the left block with Pippen behind him and Jordan rotating from the weak side. Stockton was at the top of the key. The play called for the entry pass, the post-up, the two-man game that had made them the most effective pick-and-roll partnership in the history of the game to that point. Malone caught the entry, felt Pippen's resistance, made his first move, a jab step right that had worked 900 times in 11 seasons, and worked now in the sense that Pippen respected it, and Malone created the angle he wanted. He turned. His right shoulder went back toward the baseline. His footwork was perfect. It was always perfect. And Jordan was there. Not where Jordan was supposed to be. Where Jordan had decided to be. The rotation had come from a position 2 steps further from the strong side than the standard rotation required, which meant it had arrived a full half-second earlier than Malone's read of the defensive scheme had predicted. And in half a second, Karl Malone's options collapsed from 3 to 1, and the one that remained was a turnaround jumper with Jordan's right hand in his face, from a distance close enough that Jordan could see the precise moment when Malone understood what had happened. 7 seconds. From the moment Malone caught the entry pass to the moment Jordan's hand arrived in his line of vision, 7 seconds had elapsed. 7 seconds in which the patience of an entire first half, the stored provocation, the filed remark, the 2 quarters of careful observation, had converted itself into positioning so precise that Malone, who had spent 11 years making defenders look insufficient, found himself with the ball and a hand in his face, and no good answer. Malone shot. The contact from Jordan's hand altered the arc. The ball hit the back of the rim, hard, with the sound that shots make when the physics are wrong from the moment of release, and bounced long. Jordan came down, caught the outlet pass from Rodman, and was already in transition before the building had processed what had happened. He scored in transition, a right-hand finish at the rim that was almost casual, almost uninterested, the kind of basket a great player scores when his mind is already 2 possessions ahead of his body. The Bulls led by 1. They would extend it to 7 by the end of the 3rd quarter and hold it through the 4th, winning 109-101. Jordan finished with 41 points, 8 assists, and 5 rebounds. He did not have a poor quarter. He had no quarter in which he scored fewer than 9 points. He was, across the full 48 minutes, exactly what he always was, which was the most complete basketball player on the floor in any building he entered. And the completeness was not merely in the scoring or the defense or the playmaking, but in the quality of his intelligence about the game and about the specific humans he was playing against and what they could and could not tolerate, and where, precisely, their confidence resided and how, precisely, to arrive at that location before they expected you. Malone finished with 32 points and 11 rebounds. These were the numbers of a great player having a great game. They were the numbers that, on most nights against most opponents, would have been enough. They were not enough. He understood this in the locker room after the game with the intellectual honesty that had always characterized his public accounting of his own performances. He did not blame the referees. He did not blame the altitude adjustment his opponents had failed to make. He identified what had happened with the clarity of a man who had watched enough basketball to understand when he had been outplayed and by how much and in what specific dimension. The specific dimension was time, not the time on the game clock, but the internal time that great players operate in, the temporal compression that allows a player with Jordan's processing speed to be in the correct position half a second before anyone else has identified what the correct position is. Malone had spent 11 seasons being the man who arrived at the position before the defense expected it. He had spent this particular 3rd quarter experiencing what it felt like when that principle was applied against him by someone faster, not in the legs but in the mind, and the experience had been educational in the way that all genuine encounters with excellence are educational, which is to say it told him something true about the hierarchy of things that no statistic or reputation or prior record could have communicated as directly. He would not make the same remark again. Not about Jordan's patience being a thing that could be tested, not in that tone, not with that implication. This was not because he lacked the courage of his opinions, but because the opinion had been tested against evidence and the evidence had not supported it, and Karl Malone was above all things a man who updated his positions when the evidence required updating. He would go on to be one of the 2 or 3 best power forwards in the history of the game. He would win MVP awards. He would be magnificent in ways that the 1996 loss to Chicago did not diminish and could not diminish. He would carry January 16th into the rest of his career not as a wound, but as a datum, a single point of information in the long data set of what Michael Jordan was and what Michael Jordan could do to your best laid plan if you gave him a reason. Jordan, for his part, was already on the plane. Not literally, not yet. But the game had ended and the clock had moved, and Jordan's attention had relocated to wherever it relocated after the thing that needed to happen had happened, which was forward, always forward, to the next calculation and the next opponent and the next piece of stored information waiting to be converted. He dressed in the visiting locker room under the Delta Center with the same invariance he brought to every post-game, the same sequence, the same pace, the same quality of being entirely present without being available for the kind of reflection that the moment might have invited from a player with less pressing business in the future. Phil Jackson would write later that what distinguished Jordan from every other competitor he had been around was not the desire to win, which was common among great players, but the desire to be right. Not correct in a factual sense, but right in the sense of having executed the thing you had seen in your mind with sufficient precision that the execution and the vision were indistinguishable. The scoring was almost incidental to this desire. The scoring was the evidence that the vision had been accurate and the execution complete, and once the evidence existed, the vision moved on to the next thing it needed to be right about. It was a desire that had no off position, a fire that did not reduce to coals when the game ended but only banked itself for the following morning, when the next film session would produce the next vision and the cycle would begin again. This is what the veteran who decided to test Jordan's patience had encountered. Not a patient man in any ordinary sense, but a man whose patience was not a temperamental quality, but a tactical one, deployed not because Jordan was inclined toward restraint, but because Jordan understood that the maximum conversion of provocation into performance required time. The filing had to happen, the observation had to accumulate, the evidence had to be complete before the spending began. And when the spending began, it was total and precise, and it arrived from exactly the position you did not expect, at exactly the moment you had convinced yourself you were safe. 7 seconds. The distance between the provocation in the second quarter and the blocked plan in the third quarter was measured not in seconds, but in an entire architecture of stored information, deployed at the moment of maximum efficiency. You cannot test the patience of a man who has transformed patience into a weapon. You can only trigger its use, and once triggered, you will spend the rest of the game, and perhaps longer, learning what it means to have done so. The lesson is not about basketball. The lesson is about what your restraint is for. If it is merely temperamental, it can be provoked away from you. But if it is strategic, if you are holding it in reserve not because you lack the fire, but because you understand the exact moment when fire converts most efficiently into result, then the person who tries to test it has not found your weakness. They have simply started the clock.